Welcome back to our Lecture 2 for Unit Level 1 discussion on the origins of agriculture, culture, and civilization. Today's lecture will be focusing on the rise of the civilizations in Mesopotamia. Here we'll be looking at what it takes to make a civilization, the area known as Mesopotamia, and a little bit about a culture of one of those civilizations in the Mesopotamia region. While you're watching this lecture, please make sure that you put away all your distractions, including cell phones, TV, game systems, and things like that. And while you are working on this lecture, please make sure you have your Lecture 2 worksheet out and are working on it. If you don't have the worksheet, remember you can always click on and print it off from here, or just simply take some notes down. It's better than having nothing. Remember that during the video you are encouraged to use the pause button if you need it in order to get all the information. Please make sure you are listening to the entire lesson, not just the items that are popping up on the screen, but everything, because there are parts and things that I'm going to talk about that are not in the notes, but you are still expected to know. Now that all the reminders are done, let's get started. Setting the stage. How big of a deal was agriculture, do you think? Well, how many people do you think like to eat? Without agriculture, people would have to continue to be hunter-gatherers. People would have to roam the area looking for food. However, remember that once people realized the benefits of tending their own crops, people were able to stay in one place and have a surplus of food, thereby allowing for their population to expand. Once people started staying put, their dwellings began to get larger, and the areas began to become more organized communities. As population increased, cities gradually grew. And as the cities grew, there was less of a need for everyone to be involved in agriculture. Economics began to matter. People began to understand the value of work and trade. As more people were able to be fed, more and more people began staying in one place. These small villages would eventually grow into sustainable cities. Farming became easier due to advances in technology and the domestication of animals. The domestication of animals simply refers to the ability of people being able to keep animals round up at home or right outside their homes, kind of like cattle. Because of the use of agriculture, bigger harvests were a result from new and better technologies like hand tools. It is a fact that the more food you have in supply, the bigger the population that can be supported. The more food there is, the more people there'll be. As cities grew, so did the responsibilities of those who lived there. Not everyone needed to farm. One farmer could create enough food for maybe 10 people. There was no point to having so much food. The technology of the wheel and the sail allowed for trade to occur over long distances. We'll talk more about this later. This was a time before any type of money was currency. No coin, no bills, nothing like that. The economy was mostly a type of a barter system, which is what they were using. And as cities grew, social classes began to emerge. Those people that were considered better than others based upon what they had or could sell would be considered at the higher levels of society compared to other people who may not have that same type of opportunity or ability. We also would see that religion would begin to become more organized as well. Based on findings, people began to worship in large groups at a specific location, rather than smaller groups and at their own homes or very small tent areas. They actually started to get together with people of other similar religious beliefs and worship together as a group. So, how civilization develops, you might ask. Well, civilizations are a complex form of culture that consists of 5 specific characteristics. First, every civilization consists of some sort of an advanced city. The size of an area doesn't distinguish a city from a village. You can have a small area of land that is considered a city. The opposite can also be true, where a large area of land does not necessarily mean it can't be a village. You see a lot of villages when you get out of the main cities, like farming areas today, for example. Hundreds and hundreds of square miles, but it's still only part of a smaller community or village. Not too many people there, but it's a very large area. The size of the region does not necessarily mean that it's a city. One of the key parts to having an advanced city is that it must also be a center for trade, the buying and selling of goods and or services. This creates an economy within the area for the people to live here and make money, because it's all about the money, of course. Next part of a civilization is that it needs to have specialized workers. Specialization is the development of skills of a specific type of work. An example might be someone who is good at making tools and turns that into a profession. Not everyone might be good at making tools back in the day, so they would rely on those few who did it really well. One specific type of a specialized worker might be an artisan. These people were skilled workers who make things with their hands. An example of an artisan might be a painter, sculptor, or just a builder. Although it doesn't seem that important in regards to the big pictures and how a civilization might function, artisans are what makes a civilization unique. You can learn a lot about a civilization just by looking at their artistic creations. The third characteristic of a civilization is its complex institutions. An institution is a long-lasting pattern of organization in a community. Things that have been there for a long time that help identify what was important to that culture or society. Can you think of anything in our culture that's been around for a very long time that is very important for our society today? Some examples of an American institution might include our government, our ability to practice religion, and the economy, or our idea of capitalism. These things have been around for a very long time and help to define to others what it means to be a member of our American civilization. Record keeping is also an intricate part of a civilization. Included with record keeping, you have taxes being collected, laws being passed, and the storage of grain or other similar items. Around 3000 BCE, which stands for before current era, scribes, or professional record keepers, invented a writing system called cuneiform. If you look on page 21 in your textbook, you can see an example of cuneiform. It's all simply a wedge that's pushed into soft, wet clay to make symbols. They would use this type of writing to keep records, to communicate and keep track of the different things they need to keep track of. Did somebody pay taxes? How much grain was produced during this harvest? Which person took this much grain from the storage? It's important to keep track of these things, because if somebody takes more grain than they're supposed to, and if it's not recorded, they're going to have a short on grain for everybody else. So record keeping even today is extremely important. Finally, you need to have some form of advanced technology. This is the last piece to be considered on whether your culture is actually civilized. Okay? An example of an advanced technology might simply include plows, pottery wheels, or the using of bronze in the creation of tools and weapons. Although these items seem very basic and insignificant by today's standards, even today, there needs to be some form of advanced technology in order for an area to be considered civilized. Earlier I mentioned something called bronze. Bronze is simply copper and tin that have been melted together, and you get a whole new substance called bronze. Bronze is very malleable, bendable, and easy to work with. It is a soft metal, but considering what the options were before, it is very effective in making the tools that they needed for their agriculture and weapons. Now that we have the basics of what it takes to be considered a civilization, let's focus now on the first known civilizations. The first civilization occurred in an area known as Mesopotamia. Today, we also know it as the Fertile Crescent. Mesopotamia ran from the Mediterranean Sea in the west, followed the rivers of the Euphrates and the Tigris, and ended up southeast into the Persian Gulf area today. You will find that almost all civilizations existed next to or near some sort of water or fresh water supply. This was because water is needed to survive, as well as to produce and provide the opportunity for travel and trade with others. Let's take an even closer look at this region. Let's look at the region of Mesopotamia and its geography. Most of Mesopotamia is located in present-day Iraq. It also spreads west into the modern-day countries of Syria, Lebanon, and Israel. Because of how the rivers flow and the foliage of the land, the curved shape has led scholars to call it the Fertile Crescent. Fertile meaning that it's able to produce a lot of agriculture, and crescent simply referring to the fact that it's kind of an arc. Think of like a crescent moon. As I mentioned earlier, the Tigris and the Euphrates River runs through the region and provides water and transportation. One of the most interesting parts of the river is that when it would flood, it would do it unpredictably. After the water would recede or run away, it left a thick layer of a mineral called silt. Silt is great for agriculture. It's full of minerals that allow different types of agricultural products to grow very productively. The problem, though, is it was, like I said, unpredictable. Sometimes it would not flood, causing desert-like conditions. The solution used by the people would be irrigation, or the moving of water from one place to another. They would literally dig ditches from the rivers away from them into their fields where they were producing their crops for their agriculture. So they had to improvise if they did not have flooding in a particular year. The region of Mesopotamia was generally flat and didn't provide any real natural barriers for protection from outside warriors or sometimes even the weather. The solution for this was they actually ended up building walls around their cities. Makes sense, right? And finally, because natural resources were scarce, those that lived in the region relied on trade to get any goods or things that they needed, but were not able to be grown or created in their own area. So they relied on trade with other areas. One of the earliest successful civilizations that we know of was the area known as Sumer. Here we see it existed in the southern area of what is Mesopotamia, and it lasted from about 3200 BCE up until about 2360 BCE. The people that lived in the region of Sumer were known as Sumerians. Makes sense, right? The Sumerians exemplified the 5 characteristics required to have a civilization. The Sumerians were a group of people that had developed city-states, which are cities that functioned like independent countries, but were as small as cities. They were independent from other cities around them. They would have their own leaders, their own set of rules and laws. They would be independent cities from one another, even though these cities might be somewhat near each other. Early on, government was controlled by a temple priest, or a type of religious leader. These religious leaders would have their central government in what was called a ziggurat, which is simply a place of worship. It would be like their town hall. The people would organize at the town hall, they would worship, they would talk about the concerns of the city, so it had multiple functions. Sometimes, depending on which city-state you lived in, a military leader would become ruler and pass his power to his son or other relatives upon his death. When leaders pass on their leadership to a family member, the family becomes part of a dynasty. A dynasty is simply a series of rulers that came from the same family. Because these city-states were so close to each other, people from different areas would mingle and trade ideas. This is known as cultural diffusion, or the spreading of ideas or products from one culture to another through conquest or trade. Excuse me. This is what a ziggurat looked like. A tall structure that acted as the center of town, as well as the religious center for the city. It's kind of like the city hall. Let's take an even deeper look at the Sumerian culture, just for a moment. Sumerians were polytheistic, which means that they believed in more than one god. Part of that belief was that when you die, you would go to the land of no return, as they called it, which was a dismal and gloomy place apparently. As we see that throughout the year, with most civilizations, the Sumerians had social classes. The hierarchy of power based upon your status in the city. For example, on the bottom, as you can see with the picture here, the slaves were the lowest part of society, but there was more of them than anybody. As compared to the top of the pyramid, we would have kings and legislators and priests. There were a lot fewer of them, but they had all of the power. A lot of that even continues on today in a lot of societies around the world, this type of pyramid hierarchical system. One interesting thing about Sumerians was the way that they treated their women. Women actually had more rights than that of a lot of later civilizations. One example is that women were able to get an inheritance and had the ability to own their own land. One of the first cities we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about is the city of Ur, which is another one of those small city-states. It flourished about 5,000 years ago and had reached a population of about 30,000 people. They had built up walls to protect them from other city-states who were looking to take their land. They used a trading system known as the barter system, where instead of trading for money, they would trade for goods or services. So if you have some, let's say some wheat to sell, and I have some goats that I don't need, I might offer you, hey, you can have my 2 goats for 2 bushels of wheat. They would trade product for product. That's known as a barter system. They would also practice religion and worship at the ziggurat at the center of the city, which we kind of talked about earlier. Here we see Ur in the southern region of present-day Iraq. As you can see, it was located right next to the Euphrates River, which is still there today. This is an artist's idea of what Ur might have looked like. It had a centralized area, protected by walls, with the ziggurat inside as well. Outside the walls, you can see smaller dwellings and homes and shops as well. It was usually those people on the top part of that pyramid that would have the privilege of living within these tall buildings or within these walls. You might also kind of see that there's kind of a moat kind of around the area, which served as another type of protective barrier to keep enemies at bay if they would try to attack. As with most ancient civilizations, Sumer ended up being conquered in 2350 BCE by a guy by the name of Sargon of Akkad. Sargon would eventually create the world's first empire, which is the bringing together of several peoples or nations under the control of one ruler. Throughout our history, we will talk about many different types of empires throughout different parts of the world, and how these different leaders were able to bring all these different groups from all these different regions together under one leadership. One of these rulers would come from Babylon and go by the name of Hammurabi. He would create one of the first set of rules, standard rules, for an empire. These set of rules would become known as Hammurabi's Code. Hammurabi's Code was a single, uniform set of laws engraved in stone to help unify the diverse groups within his empire. And here we kind of see what that looked like. This is a sample of one of his what's known as steles, which is pillars where he wrote his laws on. We're going to take some time later on to look at these laws and determine if they were actually fair, why they existed, and were they effective. We'll get to that in the next upcoming lessons. Though Mesopotamia would be the beginning of civilization, it wasn't long until others began to take hold as well. South and east of Mesopotamia, a new civilization was slowly evolving and would become one of the most well-known mysterious civilizations of all time. I wonder if you can guess what it was. And with that, we are finishing up our lecture on Mesopotamia and the creation of civilizations. I hope you enjoyed it. Looking forward, we'll be looking into Egypt eventually, but beforehand, we're going to get a little bit into talking about Hammurabi's Code and this set of rules that he set up. If you have any questions, please feel free to let me know, as always, and feel free to go back to check out the video or any other type of resource you may need to help you fill in any extra blanks or to help further clarify anything you might not have completely understood. So with that, I'm done. And as one of my favorite authors would always say at the end of his lessons, stay awesome. Have a great day.